Hi, I'm Joel Popadics and welcome to my studio. The Presby Memorial Iris Gardens in Montclair, New Jersey has all different kinds of irises. Every spring, many of my students go there to photograph and paint these beautiful blooms. They know that this flower's multiple colors and irregular shapes makes a great subject for a watercolor. In this video, we're going to get out our purple and yellow watercolors and paint a shapely iris. We'll explore the concept of color complements, practice good shape making, and embrace the challenges of wet blending. The best place to set up a floral is in a room that has a northern exposure. Artists for centuries have favored this cool, constant light. I set up our arrangement on a table next to a white wall with the north light coming in from the right. Before you try this video, go to my website at watercolorpop.com and on the Paint Along with Pop page, download my notes and reference. You'll find the links in the description box below. I suggest you watch it all the way through and then re-watch it as you paint, pausing as needed. I always like to start with a little inspiration from artists whom I admire. John James Audubon painted the bird in blue-yellow-backed warbler, but the botanical illustration of the iris was painted by his assistant, Joseph Mason. Typically, botanical illustrations are more concerned with an accurate depiction of the flower's details and less so about the overall light effect. Georgia O'Keeffe is probably the most famous iris painter. Her oil painting, Black Iris, hangs at the Met in New York. Her teacher, the great American Impressionist painter Frank Vincent Dumond, was also my teacher's teacher, and he painted this spectacular rendition of a purple iris in oils. Unlike a botanical illustration, Dumond's depiction of the flower includes the rest of the garden and is more interested in the light that illuminates the entire environment. With these images in mind, let's begin. Although the background is white, I'm not going to leave it unpainted. To me, it looks warmer in color temperature on the left and cooler as it progresses over to the right. The background is a light beige color, and since they don't sell beige, I'll have to make my own. I mix some cadmium orange, ivory black, a little red, and a whole lot of water for a light warm tone. I pour the paint onto the soaking wet paper and roll it around to blend evenly. Once you're satisfied with the blending, pour off the excess paint. For the areas of the background that are cooler, I'll add some cobalt blue and sprinkle that into the painting. You can move the paint around with a big wash brush. Again, roll the paper around to blend evenly and pour off any excess paint. It's too light at the top of the painting, so I'll come back in with a little extra background color to darken the upper left corner. The irises and vase are casting a cool shadow across the background. Because the objects are set some distance away from the wall, the shadow appears to be mostly soft edged, not as hard as you would expect a cast shadow to be. The paper is at the moist stage of wetness, so any shadow color I add now will gently soften before it dries. As you paint the shadow, keep in mind that the flower and vase determine its shape, so they should relate, but keep it vague and mysterious looking. The wet paper will help that happen. Try not to put shadows in the flower areas, because the gray color might affect the flower's vibrant color later on. As you put in more shadows,
Be careful not to add too much water at this point, as it will create a blooming stain on the paper. That's why I always dab my brush into a paper towel before I go to the painting. If you have to work back into the shadows, make sure that the paper is still at the moist stage. Use a hairdryer to completely dry the paper. I always use the back of my hand to determine if the paper has completely dried. The glass vase is slightly darker than the background, but I would like to have a few highlights appear on the glass. So I'll put in a very light wash of Payne's Gray, that's cobalt blue and ivory black, over the entire vase, skipping over the highlight areas. For every highlight that's on the front of the glass vase, there's a corresponding one on the back side of the glass. Keep that in mind as you paint. We negatively paint around the highlights. Think of this. The highlights are already done, we're just painting the spaces around them. You could begin to see the highlights start to pop now. I make areas of the vase a little darker for the thickness in the glass, especially at the bottom, and put them in while the paper is still wet, so they gently blend together. The side edges of the glass are darker because you're looking through a particularly thick area of the glass. I add these darker tones while the paper is still wet. Completely dry the paper. We're going to use a wet blending technique to paint the irises, but we'll start with a super light color. I put a tiny touch of cobalt violet into a whole lot of water and use this to mass in the flowers. The irises have a ragged exterior shape. Try to capture that as you block in the flowers. Although the irises are mostly violet, their centers are yellow, which is interesting because yellow and violet are considered to be color opposites. When color opposites are mixed together, they usually gray out or make brown. But when placed next to each other and aren't allowed to mix, they are said to be color complementary. So, as we paint, it's important to not let the violet and yellow mix together, but remain separate from each other so that they have this pleasing visual effect. I'm going to use Windsor Violet, Permanent Magenta, and Permanent Alizarin Crimson for the darker violet parts of the iris. I mix a heavy concentration of paint, like the consistency of heavy cream, and work that into the wet flower. Not only does this look good, it's fun to do. The irises have curvy striations, so try to include that into your brushwork to help suggest the flower's forms. During this time, I've worked quickly enough so that the flower hasn't dried yet. This has allowed me to wet blend all my colors together. I put little dabs of violet here and there for the speckling on the flower. Feed a little extra concentration of color along the edge of the iris where it gets a little darker. As I work, the iris is still at the moist stage of wetness. The violet parts of the iris have subtle variations in color. Some areas are slightly reddish, so I'll switch back and forth between the Windsor Violet and Alizarin Crimson. The paper is now at the damp stage, so I'll put a few lines here and there for the flower's details. I mix up some green using cadmium lemon yellow and French ultramarine blue for the flower's stalks. Some of the buds on the stalks haven't opened yet, and in those areas there's a heavy concentration of different colors, so I'll wet blend them together. When I do a landscape, I generally use flat brushes, but whenever I do a floral, I mostly use rounds. The round brush with its tapered point makes it easier to paint the flower's shape. Be sure to drop in the violet color on the bud while the green color is still wet. Like I did earlier, I mix up cobalt violet and a lot of water and mass in the other iris. I do my best to make the edges of the flower ragged and shapely. And once again, while the paper is very wet, I add cadmium yellow to the bloom's center. Be sure to completely rinse the yellow out of the brush before you load up with the violet. If you don't, you'll wind up with a brown flower. I love to watch the colors wet blend together. It's best to drop the color on the paper and move on. Don't force your will on how it mixes. That'll produce a muddy mess. The iris is at the moist stage, so it's a good time to feed a darker concentration of violet into the edges. I mix up some permanent alizarin crimson and drop that into the parts of the iris that are slightly reddish. I use a number 6 round brush with a good point to fill in some of the detail on the flower. Rinse the violet out of the brush before you mix a green for the stems to avoid making brown. It's hard to tell where the stem ends and the darker values in the glass vase begins. That's called the lost edge. I'll intentionally let these colors blend together to create that effect. The dark shapes in the vase and stem are all distorted from the refraction of the cut glass, so keep that in mind as you paint. Be sure to paint around the highlights that we so carefully generated earlier. I'm using cobalt blue and ivory black with a little bit of green for the darker values in the vase. Notice that the flat plane on the surface of the water is darker in value than the side plane. I offset the bottom of the stem from its top part that the distortion in the glass creates. I add more water into my glass color for some of the lighter values. The table is a rich chocolatey brown color. I use a prismatic palette, so I don't have any browns. I prefer to mix my browns using combinations of ivory black, yellow, orange, and red. Since the brown on the table is on the red side, I'll use ivory black and alizarin crimson. I'm using a 1-inch flat brush to mask in the table and work carefully around the elliptical shape of the vase. Normally, we don't ever want to run out of paint right in the middle of a crucial wash, but sometimes that happens to the best of us. There's a nice lost edge between the vase and the table. I'll bring some of the color from the table into the vase and prevent it from looking like it was pasted onto the paper. While the table is still wet, it's a good time to clean up the bottom edge of the vase. Some of the final steps include putting in a few additional details here and there in the flowers. Now that I have lost edges everywhere in the vase, I'll want to put back in a few found edges. There's always a nice dark accent in the bottom of the glass, so I'll drop in a super dark value into that area too. Now that the table is dry, I'll lift off some paint from the table for the reflection of the vase.
I hope you enjoyed this demo. To find out more about me and my art, visit my website at watercolorpop.com. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to see new videos as they are released. You'll find a link below. If you enjoyed this video and would like to leave me a tip, I'd greatly appreciate that. On the Paint Along with Pop page on my website, click on the commerce button that says Tip Joel. No worries if you can't. Keep watercoloring and stay well. Till next time, bye-bye.